Hi everyone and welcome to my channel. My name is Mirna Gabriel. I'm the fantasy author of the Two Lands and Horoscope, The Forces of Nature. If you would like to check out my books, I left the link in the description. Now, I love to write fantasy, but I enjoy reading classic novels, and so I made this channel to share my work and to talk about the classic books that I read. In this video, I'm going to talk about Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. If you have this book on your TBR and you don't want to be spoiled at all, come back when you've read the book. This story sits in 19th century England. Like in all of Jane Austen's novels, marriage is a focal point of the narrative, and the English inheritance law of entailment is an important plot element in her novels. If you're just starting to read Jane Austen's books, it's good to have a general background about the English society in the Regency era, because Jane Austen's novels are not just romance novels. They have a romantic story, of course, but her novels strongly focus on the domestic life of women at that time, the social norms and the society expectations in realistic everyday events, but of course in a very humorous and engaging narrative. Marriage was the dream of every young woman with a small income, and that was for a reason. Women's role in society was very limited, and they didn't necessarily have the right to inherit their family's estates. Because when they marry, everything they own becomes legally the husband's, and so the original owners of big estates usually entailed the properties to their firstborn sons and grandsons, and not to their daughters. So having security for most women mainly depended on being married and settled. The story starts with the Bennets. Mr. and Mrs. Bennet have 5 daughters, and since their estate is entailed to the firstborn male in the family, they are in constant stress of losing their home to their cousin, Mr. Collins, in case Mr. Bennet dies. And so Mrs. Bennet's only goal in life is to see her 5 daughters married and settled. On the first chapter, a very wealthy young gentleman arrives at Netherfield Park, which is very close to where the Bennets live, and Mrs. Bennet is determined to marry one of her daughters to him.
And how can that possibly affect them?
Oh, Mr. Bennet, how can you be so tiresome? You know, he must marry one of them.
Aha, so that is his design in settling here.
You must go and visit him at once.
Good heavens.
The wealthy gentleman is Charles Bingley, and after Mr. Bennet pays a social visit to Mr. Bingley, the Bennets attend a ball in which Mr. Bingley is present. There is an instant connection between Mr. Bingley and Jane, the oldest and the prettiest daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, and Jane and Bingley spend the night dancing together. Elizabeth, who is the second oldest daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, and who is also the main character of the novel, meets Mr. Bingley's close friend, Mr. Darcy. Mr. Darcy is not very pleasant like his friend. In fact, he seems to be very arrogant, as he refuses to dance with Elizabeth.
Will you dance, Mr. Darcy?
Not if I can help it.
Not only that, but she overhears him talking with his friend about her, saying that she is not pretty enough to tempt him. Let's just say he made a very bad first impression on Elizabeth. Over the next few weeks, however, Mr. Darcy finds himself increasingly attracted to Elizabeth's charm and intelligence, much to the dislike of Caroline Bingley, Mr. Bingley's snobbish sister, who grows jealous when she notices Mr. Darcy's attraction to Elizabeth, because obviously she has feelings for Mr. Darcy and wants to be noticed by him. Things take a turn when Mr. Collins proposes to Elizabeth. She turns him down and crushes her mother's hope for the connection between their family and Mr. Collins that would secure the ownership of their estate. Then a young man called Wickham, a militia officer, appears in their life, and he and Elizabeth become friends. And soon she learns the connection between him and Mr. Darcy. Wickham tells Elizabeth that Mr. Darcy had cruelly cheated him out of an inheritance that he was entitled to. Elizabeth grows to like Wickham and hate Darcy even more, but then over the course of the novel her opinions change, especially after Wickham's misconduct with Lydia Bennet, Lizzie's younger sister. At this point, Elizabeth starts to see Mr. Darcy in a different light. Because of the romantic elements in the novel, I divided the characters into couples, and there are 4 important couples that we need to pay attention to. The first couple is Miss Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy. She's the second oldest daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. She loves her family and she is Mr. Bennet's favourite child, mostly because of her intelligence and witty sense of humour. In general, Elizabeth seems to be more prudent than many girls in her age. However, she makes quick judgments about people and she's very prejudiced about her opinions. But we see her regretting her actions that were a consequence of those opinions. We tend to forgive this defect in her character largely because of her lovable qualities, but also because she is only 19, and as inexperienced as she is, she's entitled to some unwise judgments. He is the son of a very wealthy and well-established family. He is the perfect match for Elizabeth because he too is very intelligent and honest, and he loves his family. But because he is so proud, as the title suggests, he can have some harsh opinions about people that cannot be easily changed.
And would you consider pride a fault or a virtue?
That I couldn't say.
Because we're doing our best to find a fault in you.
Maybe it's that I find it hard to forgive the follies and vices of others, or their offences against me. My good opinion, once lost, is lost forever.
He is very aware of his social status and that of the people around him, and he puts a great significance on this. That air of arrogance that he has is initially what turns Elizabeth off and makes her reject his first proposal.
Is this your reply?
Yes, sir.
Are you laughing at me?
No.
Are you rejecting me?
I'm sure that the feelings which, as you've told me, have hindered your regard will help you in overcoming it.
Even though he was obviously not expecting to be rejected, he swallowed his pride because his love for Elizabeth was greater than his pride. And he demonstrated this when he rescued Lydia and the Bennets from disgrace, when Lydia elopes with Wickham, and when he stood against his aunt's wishes and went and proposed to Elizabeth a second time. There is an instant chemistry between these two characters. They first meet at Marathon Ball. They are very similar, both of them are cheerful and good-natured, and they think the best in others. Their characters seem less complicated than Darcy and Elizabeth, either because the author didn't give us much details about them, or simply because their mild and gentle characters were meant to serve as a contrast to Elizabeth's and Darcy's inward struggle to understand each other. The third couple are Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. Mr. Bennet is the father of Elizabeth, Jane, Lydia, Kitty and Mary. He is sarcastic and has a laid-back personality. He doesn't really interfere in his family's life, and he spends most of his time hiding away from his wife and daughters in his study. Elizabeth is his favourite person in the family because she's more like him than anyone else, witty with a quick sense of humour. But we gradually start to see him as an irresponsible father, especially as we see his careless indulgence to Lydia's misbehaviour that eventually leads her to run away with Wickham. The whole situation of them losing their estate, which is something Mrs. Bennet fears that they would have to face in case of her husband's death, could have been rectified if Mr. Bennet cared to secure his family financially. It is something that most men would care to do for their family in this entailment kind of situation. The author doesn't really dwell on this point, and we don't really know the reason why Mr. Bennet didn't ensure his family's security in case they had to lose the estate. I guess it was just laziness because he always thought that he would have a male heir. Mrs. Bennet is a woman with a purpose. She wants to marry her 5 daughters, and nothing else in the world is more important. She doesn't care if she appears silly or impertinent to other people. As modern readers, we understand where she's coming from. It was a rough world for women, and she wanted to secure her daughter's comfort. But since this is a novel of manners, Mrs. Bennet is represented as being ill-mannered, and she would have been the reason for her daughter's misery, because her lack of propriety almost made Bingley and Darcy not propose to Jane and Elizabeth. As we know, Mr. Collins is Mr. Bennet's nephew, and he is to inherit Longbourn Estate, the Bennet's home. He is a clergyman, and his social status is nothing to brag about, yet he is very snobbish. The author describes him as being a mixture of pride and obsequiousness, self-importance and humility. He proposes to Elizabeth filled with the utmost confidence that she would not refuse him, especially because of her family's position that would greatly benefit from this alliance. When Elizabeth actually refuses him, he could not believe it and thought that she was only trying to seem more attractive to him, that she was trying to behave with propriety. He just couldn't believe it, and right after that he goes and marries Lizzie's best friend Charlotte Lucas. She has a more practical view about marriage. She is described as sensible and intelligent, but she's not a romantic like Lizzie. Charlotte is not as optimistic as Elizabeth about finding love. For Charlotte, marriage is about the institution and how financially stable it is. Elizabeth almost feels shocked and betrayed when Charlotte chooses to marry Mr. Collins. But actually, Charlotte is just choosing to see life in a more realistic light. She knows her priorities and acts accordingly, and fulfilling those priorities is what makes her happy and content.
Oh, Lizzie, it's such a pleasure to run my own home.
Like all romantic love stories, we follow the development of a relationship between two lovers. Here it's Elizabeth and Darcy. At first there is a tension between them because of the differences in their personalities. One is too proud and the other is too prejudiced. And even though they gradually start to feel a connection, they are met by numerous obstacles that they have to overcome in order to be together. Like the society and social classes represented by Lady Catherine, Miss Bingley and Mrs. Bennet, we are reminded of realism, which is a direct contrast to romanticism by Charlotte Lucas, and her view about love as being a matter of chance. However, in Austen's novels, love prevails, and that is mainly why her novels lean more towards being a romance. In this novel, Austen suggests that love is stronger than society. This is an integral theme in the novel. Society is based on family ties and connections. People never meet as total strangers. We get introduced in social gatherings as members of different families. The characters' interaction largely depends on who they are and to whom they are related. And it is normal for an individual to be judged according to the behaviors of their family members. Which is why Darcy finds no problem in telling Lizzie that he is doing her a favor in proposing to her even though she comes with an embarrassing family connection, hence her rejection to his proposal. It's a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. This is one of my all-time favorite opening lines. It summarizes the whole story in just a few words. Of course, in the usual sense of humor we often notice in Jane Austen's books. Austen utilizes irony in her narrative. There is always a gap between what's said and what's meant. This happens in many situations. For example, when Jane goes out into the rain to visit Caroline Bingley, Mr. Bennet tells his wife that if their daughter should become dangerously ill, it would be a comfort to know that it was all in the pursuit of Mr. Bingley. He means the opposite of what he seems to be saying. He is actually implying that Mrs. Bennet is being ridiculous for wanting Jane to marry Bingley so much that she is willing to jeopardize her daughter's health. This witty and ironic way in which Pride and Prejudice is written has always been a major part of its appeal.
Thank you for tending to my sister so diligently.
It's a pleasure. Oh, I mean, sorry, not a pleasure that she's ill, of course not.
Also, these ironic situations contributes to another predominant theme in the novel, which is the theme of miscommunication and misunderstanding. And this mainly happens because of the frequent gap between the literal and the implied meaning. If you want to go more in depth into this novel, I encourage you to check out SparkNotes. They are my reference for this video. I left the link in the description. I also left the main points of this video in the description as always. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments. This is all for now. Thank you so much for watching and see you in the next video.